About 23,000 years ago, a group of people from the Altai region, relatives of the modern Chukchi and Koryaks, decided to head east to see what was out there. A few hundred of them ventured so far east that they eventually ended up in the west. Luckily, this happened during the Ice Age, when massive amounts of water were locked in glaciers. As a result, sea levels were much lower, and the Bering Strait between Asia and America could either be crossed via a land bridge or required far less swimming than it would today. After the first explorers, it seems several waves of migrants followed, until about 12,000 years ago, when the climate warmed and the water barrier became significantly harder to cross. In these new continents, people adapted quickly. Over the millennia, they developed wildly different levels of progress, some even founding full-fledged civilizations with cities and writing. North American tribes were far from homogeneous. Some stuck to Stone Age traditions, living by hunting and somehow maintaining a balance with nature for thousands of years without wiping out the buffalo or other wildlife. Others, like the Pueblo people in what's now the southwestern United States, practiced agriculture and built multi-story structures from adobe. However, even the most advanced regions of the Americas got stuck in the Bronze Age. Metallurgy here was limited to naturally occurring metals like copper, silver, and gold, found as pure nuggets. By the second millennium BCE, they had even figured out how to make both arsenic and tin bronze. Yet tools made from this alloy were rare and never saw widespread use. And while they were familiar with metal oxides, indigenous Americans never developed the technology to smelt iron in bloomery furnaces. Perhaps they missed the memo from alternate historians claiming that iron is easier to make than bronze. Since naturally occurring metals are rare and localized, by the time Europeans arrived in the 15th century, most Native Americans were still using stone tools. It's hard to say how many indigenous people lived in North America when Europeans first made contact. Some claim 50 or even 100 million, but the limited production capacity and ethnographic data suggest the number was likely between 1 and 18 million. Some researchers argue for about 4 million, given that hunter-gatherers, who made up a significant part of the population, needed several square kilometers of land per person. Numbers in the tens of millions seem exaggerated, especially considering that during the Neolithic era, when humans had started farming and using copper in parts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the global population was only around 50 million. Interestingly, the current population of pure-blooded Native Americans in the US alone is roughly 3 million, which might be close to their numbers 5 centuries ago. However, a large portion of the surviving population has struggled to adapt to modern markets. About a third live in poverty, and birth rates are now below the level needed to sustain the population. Of course, it's impossible to ignore the role Europeans played in reducing native populations. Armed with the doctrine of discovery, which claimed new lands for their countries regardless of indigenous presence, they often devastated local populations, not just through violence, but by introducing new diseases. The image of the classic Native American often involves a dark-skinned horseman with a tomahawk, but this image has two big inaccuracies. First, horses were introduced to the Americas by Europeans, with Mustangs being feral descendants of settlers' horses. Second, the tomahawk story is even more curious. Since indigenous peoples didn't have iron, metal tools were rare. Their axes were polished stone tools, similar to those used in Neolithic Europe. Without expertise, you'd have a hard time distinguishing one from the other. But if you'd arrived in early North America and asked for a tomahawk, no one would have understood you. The word was apparently coined by Captain John Smith in the early 17th century. Smith is also known for his tales of a romantic connection with Pocahontas, the daughter of a native chief. The term tomahawk is actually a distorted version of the indigenous words tomahawk or tomahawken, which referred to a cutting tool. Axes don't quite fit this category, but for a long time, colonists used tomahawk to describe almost any native weapon. British settler William Wood wrote in 1634 that a tomahawk was a 2.5-foot club with a rounded head. In fact, this kind of club, used for finishing off animals injured by arrows, was likely the original main weapon of indigenous peoples. Flint and obsidian made excellent arrow and spear tips capable of piercing even the toughest hides. While stone can be sharper than steel and works well under compression, it performs poorly under bending forces, which happen often when chopping. So while stone axes could chop trees, they were far less efficient than metal tools. Stone axes were also prone to breaking and couldn't be easily repaired. This made stone axes the weak link in any community's toolkit unless they had access to large-scale copper or bronze production. Unsurprisingly, when trade between settlers and Native Americans began, metal axes became one of the most sought-after gifts. Native Americans quickly realized that standard axes were too heavy and mainly useful for work, so they preferred lighter, more versatile designs. Ideally, these had a hammer or spike on the back, resembling a pickaxe. Europeans didn't need to invent anything new here. Light versions of boarding axes, long used by ship crews, fit the bill perfectly. On ships, axes were practical tools even outside of combat. In the age of firearms, they were used to cut ropes, break doors, or pry open chests. Native Americans traded for many valuable goods, such as beaver pelts, and Europeans quickly caught on that there was no need to offer precious metals, which they preferred to take back home. Axes worked just fine for trade. Some traders, however, started offloading subpar axes, made from the lowest quality metal without tempering and with the simplest designs. These ultra-basic models were even called trade axes by Europeans. On the other hand, some axes were tailored to impress, like pipe tomahawks, which featured a hollow handle and a bowl on the back, allowing them to be used both as a weapon and as a pipe for smoking. These tomahawks became symbols of both war and peace. The scale of this trade was massive. William Johnson, a British official in North America, noted in 1765 that 10,000 axes were needed just for trade with indigenous peoples that year. Over 2 centuries, colonial powers either sold or gifted hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these weapons. The so-called original spontoon tomahawks actually originated from European military officers' polearms, called spontoons. Tomahawks with spikes were essentially boarding axes, while those resembling picks or hammers were just colonial settlers' tools. Different tribes favored different tomahawk designs, but this was mostly dictated by the type of European colony nearby. These axes, which essentially became a form of currency, were mass-produced in Spanish, French, or British factories and shipped to the Americas ready-made. Once in native hands, they were often adorned with decorative elements. Indigenous people didn't shy away from these imported innovations, some of which transformed their societies. For example, the Apache, who were traditionally hunters and part-time farmers, embraced horseback riding and transitioned to raiding neighboring groups. Firearms also quickly caught on. However, since reloading muskets took time, they often followed up their initial volley by charging into melee, where European axes proved invaluable. Though Native American blacksmiths eventually began forging their own weapons using colonial-supplied iron, there's little that's truly indigenous or authentic about most tomahawks. The majority were European-made in the 17th and 18th centuries, specifically for trade. Sure, the tomahawk sounds Native American, but let's not kid ourselves. It's just a European word for a European axe. Yes, natives used them, but they didn't exactly rewrite the story of colonization. The irony was that even by the early 20th century, Native Americans weren't considered U.S. citizens. But Uncle Sam still had a job for them. Like the 6,000 Cherokee and Choctaw among many others sent to fight in World War I,